Most companies don't have a revenue problem, they have a structural integrity problem. I'm David Figueroa, president of Primetime Systems. This is the Revenue Integrity Gap, where executive leaders get honest about what's actually breaking underneath the growth. Let's get into it. Joining me today is Ajay Chankramath. Ajay Chankramath heads Platform Engineering Consulting, and it's the advisory arm of platformengineering.org. Now, AJ is an author, a technology leader, a former CTO, and a strong voice in this new era of AI. And today, I believe his voice brings the scars of being a practitioner and also a pattern observer. Hello, AJ. Thank you for joining us today. Before I ask you anything, AJ, I want to name the place where I think we're at. Most of the AI conversation right now is being held, in my opinion, in two altitudes. There's the hype altitude, right? Everyone's talking about AI. There's pressures and market forces, and many businesses are believing, hey, the future has arrived. But then there's the operational altitude. And I think of the folks who are involved in those decisions, the CIO who's trying to keep the employees from pasting sensitive data into public models, the CFO who's trying to figure out what of any of the pilots are actually returning return on investment. And both of those conversations are very real, but I believe they're both missing the middle. And the middle is where I keep landing, AJ. I believe AI isn't arriving in the organizations that have actually finished refining out what their operating model looks like in the AI era. And it's arriving at the top of fragmentation. The systems that don't talk to each other, the functions that don't reconcile, the commitments that don't match delivery. I think AI is being asked to make decisions faster inside operating models that couldn't make decisions cleanly before they even showed up. So I think that's the era we're actually in. And that's the premise of this argument. We're trying to make that clearly visible to try to align those two principles. And of course, I'm looking at that from the commercial side, revenue, delivery, customer commitments, the executive layer. The one view that I think has a significant voice that's looking at it from a different perspective is the engineering side, where I think your voice comes in. The platform layer where AI is actually getting embedded into how software gets built, not the buzzword layer, the layer where decisions actually get automated. So help me see what I can't see from where I sit. I want to start with the room you're actually in. You're working with some of the largest enterprises in financial services, fintech, healthcare, with platform engineering and AI right in the center focus. So when you walk into one of those rooms today, who's asking you the AI questions and what are they actually trying to figure out?
Thank you, David, for this question. So, you had a lot of very interesting questions in your introduction. So, let's start by unpacking that. The first question really is, as I walk into some of those leadership conversations today, to help organizations really figure out what's the right way for them to adopt AI and to actually make it more tangible. When I say tangible, uh, there is still a lot of confusion around what AI is bringing to them. Everybody, when I say everybody, every board of directors I talk to, every CEO I talk to, every CTOs and the CXOs I talk to, everybody is right on one thing, that AI is a disruptor. That I think we all can agree on. Now, there is another aspect that we are not quite agreeing on. That is the aspect of what's the best way to use AI. That indeed, in my mind, is the real gap that we see within the industry. Depending on who you talk to, or depending on the time of the day, the blog that you read, the podcast that you listen to, the YouTube video that you watch, you could literally get hundreds of opinions there without a clear mandate on what's the best way to do it. Now, early on, one of the questions that you asked in your introduction was, are we ready as an industry to be able to adopt this? Is this at a point when things are mature enough, or has it actually plateaued at some level of maturity? My answer to that is absolutely not. We are still learning things and we're still struggling with things. I'll give you an example of something that is, again, it's on, I think, Washington Post today, and Wall Street Journal reported this a couple of days back or something. It's a major event going on, as you all know, with respect to OpenAI and the Hugging Face issue. This is one case that proves that having AI do its thing without the right kind of guardrails to be able to do the kind of things it's supposed to do is going to have a huge issue. For those of you who are not really caught up on this particular issue, right? Let me just give you like a quick 1 minute overview of what happened here. OpenAI was evaluating this frontier model on some kind of a cybersecurity benchmark. This is something that's getting a lot of press today because of the fact that the competitor Anthropic has been doing more work on the cybersecurity side of things. So essentially, what they did was they did this benchmarking activity with certain safety classifiers disabled. So think of it like they're doing an experiment. So you don't want to have all the guardrails for your experiment, but so far so good. Now, instead of solving the challenge, what the model did was essentially they exploited a 0-day risk within their own package. So think of it like you are a student doing an exam. You're in a room, you're given a paper to go actually write your answers. So if the student decided to actually get out of the room, jump out of the window, go to the teacher's house, grab the answers, and then come back and say that I'm done here, would that be fair? That is precisely what OpenAI did in this case. Now, let's look at how this actually get exasperated in the industry along the whole thing. This particular issue was probably less of a business impact for anybody because it was an experimental activity. But if you're running a business, if you're a CTO or a CEO running a business, if you are running processes that are actually going to have an impact like this, if it's actually going to break the rules and go do certain things, what's the limit? And what's the real benefit for humanity as we are really looking at it? So, to precisely answer your question, that is the single biggest challenge that most people are thinking of today when I talk to. How do you make sure that I use the AI the right way?
And I love the reference to the OpenAI situation that's currently taking place. While it's an experiment, it's a glaring example of the risk and a little bit of the autonomy that AI is taking today. It actually makes me think about a challenge that our executives are having. Our functional teams, including the functional resources within a particular department, are all not only encouraged to utilize artificial intelligence in many different ways. From an organizational strategic perspective, we're also trying to find opportunities where we can automate, right? We want to take the tedious activities and put some agents on that, and they can work much faster. And we can now have resources work on more, let's just say, beneficial areas for the operating model. But I also believe while that is taking place, the North Star is constantly moving when I don't believe it should. I think the North Star, not that it needs to be fixed, because every time you do strategy planning and strategy review, you take your SLT team and you start to think about what market forces you have. You should have somewhat nimble BHAG. But in the same respect, you need to remember what brought you to the dance. I think what happens is the AI causes a bit of confusion, and it's almost like tangents or rabbit holes, diversions from your strategic roadmap of where you want to go. So, from an engineering perspective, what do you believe concerns executives today about what AI is actually doing for their business? What are genuinely the real signals of not only advantages, but more importantly, the risks? This episode is brought to you by Platform Engineering Consulting, the advisory arm of platformengineering.org, a 300,000 plus member community that define platform engineering as a discipline. PEC advises enterprise platform teams on operating models, governance, AI readiness, and measuring platform ROI. Their focus is regulated industries, financial services, insurance, healthcare, federal, life sciences, and fintech, where platform decisions carry compliance, audit, and risk implications that generic engineering advice oftentimes misses. Platform engineering in these domains is not just about developer productivity. It's about standardizing delivery paths so that governance, security, and observability are built into the platform, not bolted on after. PEC's clients include teams such as Fiserv, Prime Therapeutics, and global financial institutions. They make their clients' teams more capable and self sufficient for an agentic first world. Find out more at platformengineering.org.
Historically, the whole idea of platform engineering has been that you're going to provide the right kind of guardrails or right kind of paved paths for your engineering teams to go do the right things. So this is essentially built on this idea of not having some kind of handcuffs you are sort of by constraining your developers, but providing your developers the kind of things that they need to be thinking about, not about writing a code to actually to build a product, because sometimes that part is the easy part. The challenge is to know what are all those NFRs, those non-functional requirements as you're building it. Because there is a huge difference between somebody writing a piece of code and making sure that that code is scalable, secure, and doing the right thing to ensure that the business runs the right way. So, one of the things that we are hearing a lot of very interesting anecdotes and stories from the industry with respect to what is happening with AI. Last year, I'm not going to name names, last year, one of the founders who's not a technologist decided to do that. I mean, one of the big things that was going on last year was this whole SaaS is dead. Now everything can be actually wipe coded. So this SaaS product thinker, product developer, went ahead and built this product saying that I'm actually going to go wipe code my whole SaaS solution, and I don't need all these developers to be able to do that. So this gentleman went ahead and did that and made a huge splash on X. It's got like millions of views and retweets and all that. Within a matter of 3 weeks, the amount of security breaches that he has had, amount of concerns that he had from the end users, literally led to the point that pretty much all his users were running for their lives. So, what did he not do that the engineering teams over the past how many ever years, 50 years, have done the right way? Which is essentially to build a right kind of path to be able to get all your non functional requirements to translate a code into a product. So, think of it like you need to have some kind of trust established to be able to have these products. And the first part of it is that in order for you to get the trust, getting those operationalized, you need something called this platform layer. And there is also this aspect of governance, which I know that we want to dig a little bit deeper into today. So governance historically has been something that has lived in a document, maybe a PDF file, or in the old days, we used to have binders with governance rules and things like that. Those things are things that can't keep up with any kind of machine decisions. So simplest way to think about a platform in this context is, what if we were to take all these thousands of pages of documentation and made it codify that so that you can really use that as part of your development workflow without your developers having to worry about it? So what are these kinds of things? This would be things like your identity. Like when somebody says who they are, historically our only concern was that other developers going to say, hey, I have the privilege to do something when I don't. So they need you to check that and make sure that's the case. Now, if you going back to that OpenAI example, we have agents doing a lot of these kinds of things. So how do you actually establish that identity for the agents? The other thing is the permissions that comes along with the agent. Just because I say that I am who I am doesn't mean that I would have the permission, because depending on the team I'm in, depending on the kind of activity that I'm working on, I would have different permissions. Now, in the age of AI, one thing that has become far more important in all of these things is the budgets, because we know that But 45 minutes of an completely unregulated, uncontrolled agent can completely bankrupt a company, literally, right? I mean, so how do you actually have the cost controls there? So those are all the kind of things that you should have as part of your platform idea. So now you ask specifically like which of these components are doing better at with AI versus not. So one thing we know is that code generation is being completely commoditized. The multiple examples I gave you already sort of validates that fact. But code generation isn't really the value generator anymore. The value is like how do you actually translate that code into a product that works well? This is where platform engineering comes in again. So the whole idea of AI governance is not a new activity. What we are trying to do is that the pivot paths that I've been talking about, which we have practiced over using a lot of different names over the years. When I started my career, we basically called it as like, how do I assist a developer to do a better job? Then it became like we started talking about activities like DevOps, and then we talked about SRE when we talked about platform engineering and all that. All those things are going to that same cause. Essentially, what we are saying is that how do you make sure that your developers can do things better? And that is exactly what we have to really think about in the AI world too. And that's what the leaders are thinking. Because one last point on this is that the pattern across every AI incident in the press that we hear is the same thing. It's like escape from a sandbox of something is happening, or a database getting deleted, or some kind of a leaked source code and all that. But without going into all those specific details, this is not a model failure. This is not a failure of the fundamental models that are actually driving this. It is the question of like, how do you actually build your scaffolding around the model to make it do the right thing? And that's what a lot of the questions coming from the leadership are. And that is exactly what platform engineering is helping.
And it's almost like platform engineering somewhat as a governance layer over coding and developing and programming and engineering. Obviously, coding has been commoditized. The ability to code at the rate of speed that we're coding today is unsurmountable. It's something we haven't seen before. But the discipline, and I think that's probably the right word, the discipline that's centered around we can code faster, but how are we protecting and what are the guardrails? How do our developers really control the mechanisms for all of the agents to run properly under our paradigm? I think of security and the leakage and some of those instances that you had mentioned. What are the hidden risks? So you spoke about SaaS. Buying a SaaS platform, depending on the size and the order of magnitude, had to go through a procurement process. There was approvals, there was diagnosis, there was layers in terms of how you purchase. The buying decisions today are much less friction. There's now just a credit card and a website. So that autonomy and that freedom to just deploy, even when you go free, how about the free trials when you're just shipping data? So when I start to think about the sensitivity around what's happening, this agent is now shaping my behavioral model for my employees. Is that the culture that I'm driving? Are they maintaining what I want that employee or that resource to be doing with my customers? Because AI is kind of just shaping that conversation completely in a silo. But when I start to think about the sensitive data that is being shipped out to the public AI systems, I'd love to hear your voice, but not the compliance slide. I'd love to understand a little bit deeper from an engineering perspective. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, again, a great segment into what we want to talk about here. As you really look at some of the executive concerns, that's where I would like to start a lot of these conversations from, because we want to make this practical and really see what's in it for the business when you're looking at the technology. So the executive concerns, there's a signal and a noise there, if you were to really categorize it that way, right? The noise is that there is this model level fear. So there's this benchmark races that is coming. So now we have the Kimi K3 coming. There's all kinds of very interesting open weights models coming out. Then this timeline of AGI that we used to watch in sci-fi movies, now far more interesting movies being made. And the reality is getting stranger than the fiction that we have seen in the past. Now, there's also the question of which model is the smartest. There's like model race happening. So the model, if you ask me, is still a commodity. Everyone rents that same intelligence at that same price. So, sort of obsession over the kind of strategy around the models is probably wrong. I mean, so that's the to me that is the noise, where that's where it gets most press because Anthropic comes out of the model or OpenAI does it. Gets a lot of press. Great, that's all great, but keep understanding the fact that you can buy that. That's a commodity, and your competitor can buy that too. There is nothing that is stopping a competitor from buying it. Now, the signal here, that is a noise. So the signal here would be what's already happening inside the building. So your ungoverned AI in your developer workflow, your agent with protection access and no identity and an AI spend that cannot tie to a business number. That's the signal to me.
Hmm.
And the risk is never about what AI might become because we can't predict, but we are all reasonably intelligent human beings. We can say, okay, things are going in a really strange direction. But it's a question of how do you actually connect your employees to that? But there are lots of examples over the past few years that this has really been like shown. I think in a couple of years back, you might remember Microsoft had this, some AI researchers were sharing the training data on GitHub and that had some kind of a misconfigured storage token that immediately exposed about, I don't know, 40 terabytes of like data or something like that. This included a whole bunch
Hmm.
of internal messages, the credentials and all that. So nothing wrong with the model there, everything wrong with the
Hmm.
workflow. So when you really look at it and say AI created that problem, or we shouldn't do AI because it created the problem, that's absolutely the wrong way of looking at it. AI had nothing to do with it. It is about, did you miss the right kind of signal and go after the noise? And that's probably what happened. So, one thing that I keep talking to everybody I talk to and every conference I go to, this is exactly where I start. Like, AI is an amplifier, not a clarifier. So, it accelerates whatever operating model that's already exists within your organization. Your
Yep.
governed loops with definitions of done provides you a lot more clarity. If you don't have the definitions of done, if you don't verify, if you don't have the ownership, the same
Yep.
confusion happens.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, because you think about your decision velocity. So
Yep.
your decision velocity is going up, it's shooting up, it's exponentially growing,
Yep.
but your trust infrastructure isn't. And to me, that is the integrity gap. That integrity gap is something that executives and the leadership and actually the engineers and the people who are actually doing it should be thinking about. So what happened was that most enterprises ended up buying that speed. So essentially saying that, oh, I can get one engineer to do things faster. But speed without verification produces unverified output much more faster than it used to. That's all it does.
Means
Exactly.
exactly. Hmm.
And we can't, historically, we humans have proved that we can't keep up with things that we do, and which is why we have products with problems. Software has bugs and products have problems because we can't test and things do things well. Now we are sort of making that whole process go on steroids and expecting things to just work. That doesn't sound right.
That's right. In fact, what we're also doing is accelerating and getting larger problems if the operating model is not correct, if our substrate isn't refined and we're not working from a solid foundation, the AI is actually going to accelerate what those cracks look like. And in fact, probably make the cracks larger.
Right. Absolutely.
You mentioned something that was really cool. And I think that I mean, it actually is a very large concept, and if we would want to unpack that, we probably don't have enough time in this
Yeah.
episode. I talk about this operating model and how AI accelerates the cracks in the operating model for goodness, a long time now. And of course, again, I look at it from a commercial perspective and an executive layer. You're looking at it from an engineering layer, from a platform engineering perspective. I've read a note that you wrote, and I found it to be very interesting, and I thought we should unpack today. And it's the difference between what AI watches versus what AI that works.
Right.
I love that because Prime, we kind of do both. We watch because we're API, we're sucking in data and we're assessing, and that's where our agents are all kind of assessing and analyzing and building narrative around, but in the same time, we work. That's where the AI is working. I'd love to unpack that with you from an engineer platform engineering seat.
Absolutely, I would love to do that.
It's really
Yeah.
interesting. It's super deep and wide. I mean, it's a very large and true, something that should resonate with all the listeners today.
So to understand that, I want to give it somewhat of a context, and not a story, more of a context. If you think about shadow, I mean, we have all heard of shadow IT. It means people go and do their own thing because I don't like what is being offered, I don't get it. So, like that, there is this concept of shadow AI. And when somebody sees a shadow AI, they think, oh, these people are very indisciplined. They should actually be disciplined by bringing in all kinds of stuff to actually constrain them so that they don't go do shadow AI. But to me, shadow AI is not a discipline problem. It is more of a demand signal because what your
Mm.
employees are doing there is sort of they're routing around those official channels for like some reason that shadow your AI approach worked. So the sanctioned path that your enterprise said that, hey, this is what you should do, that is not ideal for the people who are consuming it. That's why a few years back, within the platform engineering space, we sort of landed on this idea of paved paths. So, just to unpack that a little bit, the idea of paved paths is such that if you take this 80/20 rule that we apply for everything, what we are saying is that 80% of your consumers, whether it is your consumers are engineers or security people or like end consumers of your product, whoever they are, 80% of the people have a very consistent set of needs and wants, and that is what we should really codify and make sure that that is standardized. The purpose of standardizing is that you can get all the illities that comes along with it in a nice way without every developer having to think about it. If you are, I mean, I've in the past run organizations with hundreds of, in some cases, 1,000+ developers and all that. And any leader who's, or any software developer or a product developer who has done those things understand the challenge when you get those many number of people doing it. So that was the idea of paved paths. The 80/20 rule is important in the sense that while you're focusing on that 80%, you don't want to forget about your 20%. Meaning, you don't want to constrain your 20% by having these golden cages. They're saying, then I can't get out of code. No, provide them the kind of flexibility to be able to do something that they need to do. So, your shadow AI, in this case, moving from shadow IT, is doing the kind of guardrails or the governance that you need for that. And that is where it would be really fascinating to see how organizations are going there. Now, there is this whole sovereignty stake within that. And again, that is something that we can probably come back, but that is something that you need to be thinking about. Meaning, if the people who are actually given the kind of flexibility, sovereignty to do whatever they need to do, what's the overall set of constraint? How do you describe that, and how do you define that kind of thing? Now, to your point about having something in that slide version, the principles versus the real world of how this is happening, in my mind, the real governance is engineered into any kind of workflow and something that gets executed at every request. So this is not something that you write somewhere. So in my mind, there are
Yeah.
five mechanisms through which you can actually do this. Number one, I briefly touched upon earlier, identity for every agent. There should be no anonymous actors in production, kind of thing. Number one. Number two would be something I call as the scoped permission. So this is where, for those of you who follow technology, I'm sure this idea of least privilege. So essentially, nobody gets access to anything unless they absolutely need it, kind of thing. So you start with that kind of zero privilege idea. Third one is the budgets. So basically, making sure that there is caps on every attempts and spend, every retry budget. Exactly, for those people who are familiar with the ideas of site reliability engineering and all that, similar to error budget. And even if you really look at the platform that we are recording this on, right, one of the things that they tend to do is that you ask them to do something fancy, and they say, can you actually make this video really nice and change my background from my nice library back here to a nice, studio kind of background? They'd say, I can, but I want to remind you that I'm actually going to use up a lot more of your credits this month. That is a very simple way of doing it. So I think that's the budget side of things. Now, next one, fourth one, is the verification side of things. So basically, make sure that you verify everything before the work comes. So essentially, that means is there should be an inspector that review your output against the definition of done that we have defined. So an unverified work is never done. My first job, I used to have a mentor who basically told me something I've never forgotten. So essentially, what he told us, an untested code is garbage. Don't assume that it does anything, because this is the kind of mindset that we have been trying to get lots of engineers to be able to think about, but still not quite true, like we saw in the SaaS example earlier. So now the last one is this idea of, fifth one is the idea of observability, because observability essentially making sure that every agent action gets logged, attributable, and that can be replayed. So that's how I would really look at this whole space.
I appreciate you listing them out. I think that's of significant value and a step by step. In this day and age is extremely important. When I think about the governance conversation, and I believe it's parallel and in concert with the same theories that you're proposing here in that last commentary. And so, if I were to ask you, what does a real AI governance program actually look like? Is it something that's similar to the design of what you just mentioned, or is it something different? Would you recommend that a CIO implement a governance program?
So to do that, I would again go on a slight tangent and bring you back in here. First thing I would think about is, as you think about the governance, a lot of the governance is going to be tied to your model type. This is important because I don't want to keep it very generic and say do it this way, because let's be very practical. What are the CIOs doing? They're bringing in the models and using models in certain ways. So there are three types of models that we can talk about. One is this closed model. This is your OpenAI or like an Anthropic or Gemini kind of thing. Then you have this open weights. Open weights, again, it's a very, think of open weights as you're literally getting your binary. You can run it anywhere and patch it, but you can't read the source or how it was built. Recently read a nice analogy to that. Open weights, the way to think about it is that you're not getting the recipe of your food, but you're actually getting something that is cooked. Now, if I'm actually, so I like desserts, most of us do. So if I'm getting a nice apple pie or something like that, I can actually go in and take away certain layers of that I don't like, or I can actually put a whole bunch of whipped cream on top of it and all that kind of thing. So you can do all those things. That's the whole idea of open weights, but you're not going to get the recipe to be able to do that. Whereas the third one would be more of your open source, where open source, you get the recipe, you can build it, you can get people who have built the actual pie and then take it from there kind of thing. So if you really start looking at governance across these three, within your closed models, so the intelligence sort of stays within someone else's infrastructure, which means that every prompt is a data egress, meaning data is going out. So now the sovereignty is the weakest here, and the audit trails typically ends at that vendor's API. So you're actually interacting through an API. So you can see what you sent, not what happened to it. So your operational burden in that case is the lowest. So this is where most enterprises start. So the governance work here would be like, you should govern the doorway because that's all you have access to. So govern your doorway. So gateway in front of every API model. Going back to my 5 points earlier, those identity mediated access, full request logging, the egress filtering, all those kinds of things. But the concentration risk is real too, because one vendor outage in this case or a policy change can propagate through everything that's wired to it, right? But that's how you think about governance in a completely closed model. Now let's look at the open weights model, which is where all the buzz is today. So when you look at the open weights model, the idea is that weights run on your infrastructure, so the data stays home and the sovereignty sort of wins. So this is why the regulated industries tend to use a lot more of the open weights model these days. But open weights is not open source, as I said, because you can run it, not audit how it was made.
Right.
So now you have the vendor, what used to own this, essentially the hosting, the patching, the valuation, all those things. But where did these weights come from? Who signed them? And had they been tampered with? Those are the kind of governance activities you'd be thinking about. So governance work, it moves away from the doorway to the supply chain and the runtime side of things, because you're doing a provenance verification. You're looking at things like your signed artifacts. You're having a more of a vetted internal registry, and maybe you have your own eval harness. So those are things that
Right.
I've spoken and written a lot about. But now comes the interesting part, the open source models. There are a bunch of enterprises I know who are seriously looking at open source models. Again, for
Really?
yeah, less on the
Mhm.
regulated side. As I said, more regulated industries are looking at the open weights. And but this is where you have the maximum transparency and auditability. You can inspect that whole pipeline, you can look at what the community scrutiny that is happening around that. So you sort of inherit that whole entire pipeline end to end, including that whole attack surface where this is happening. And model files is more of like a malware vector, and that is not a hypothetical way of looking at it. Because,
Mhm.
so to me, the platform answer is the same across all three cases, while you look at governance differently. The model registry and the gateway is that golden path I explained earlier. So essentially, your vector models, your identity, mediated access, logged usage, things like that. So the model choice becomes sort of like a routing decisions inside one governed system, including like maybe three separate zones or something like that. So
Mhm.
what you should be thinking in that case as a CIO would be like, if you are running more than one of these types, your domain risk should decide the routing. When I say domain risk, what are the specific things that you're doing with that model? So you can have some sensitive domains and less sensitive domains.
Human resources, whatever it
Exactly.
is.
So make sure that it's got more of those secure ones. That's a sensitive domain. So they should be using
Mhm.
more of those open weights behind the gateway, more of those general purpose work that routes the API through the same way, and then you can just decide how to do that. So
Mhm.
just to sort of conclude that thought, there is this idea of AI that watches and AI that works, like we spoke about earlier. So AI that watches your dashboards, your co-pilot suggesting doing something, your summaries of your analysis. This is all advisory stuff. In that case, your human sort of stays between your output and the consequence of it. So light governance is good enough. But for AI that works, things like in the software development paradigm, opening like a pull request saying that, hey, here change this in like in the code to do something. So or you're using certain cloud resources saying reconcile that infrastructure, make sure that it is doing what it's supposed to do, provision the resources in the cloud or anywhere. These acts
Mhm.
directly on the systems of record, if you think about it. And the governance bar jumps for that, by a significant order of magnitude. And what those things are depends. And that is what most enterprises sometimes ignore. You either bring in one small layer of governance or a very high bar for the governance. Neither of those things are the right thing to do. So you should probably figure out where those things are as you're thinking about how to bring in the governance for the right kind of activities you do.
I think the mid market hasn't even encroached on much of this. I think the enterprise are already deploying MCPs and actually having a social security number around this particular effort. And once you go very large, then there's absolute discipline there. The open source is extremely interesting. While I think there's an immense amount of value from the collective intelligence, and I love how you use the dessert analogy and the metaphor. I think of it like you're reusing something that came out of the kitchen that's already been cooked.
Yep.
So the sausage making has been done. Did you have any visibility to how the sausage was made? Answer is no. But you are using the sausage and you're repurposing the sausage in many different ways. I love the dessert idea. I love to eat, so I think that's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I do believe that there's a great amount of value around governance, and I really appreciate your perspective, taking it down a level into the engineering and actually slicing it into the enterprise and segment how you would actually look at it in terms of the dimensions. In fact, Prime and the way we look at engineering is the same. We look at dimensions and zones. People say columns and rows. We use dimensions and zones because we think it's a little bit more round versus linear. Thank you again, AJ, for your time. I always want our guests to leave our listener with a drop. I'm going to ask you a question. You can go as deep as you want, as stay as high level as you like. But when I think about a CIO or a CTO that's listening to this today, and they want to make one real governance decision around AI in the next, let's just say, 90 days, And this is not a strategy, because that's a whole different conversation for a different episode. Not a task force, not a committee, just one actual decision. What should that be from your seat?
Great question. The one decision, the first 90-day activities for a CIO. Number one thing would be no agent should run anonymous. Give every AI agent an identity, the way every employee and every service already has one. This is nothing new. It has to be concrete, it has to be achievable in a quarter, and everything cascades from it. When I say everything, going back to my previous list, permissions, budgets, audit, attributions, wherever possible. Now, breaking it down from a 90-day point of view, days 1 to 30, you should start with an inventory every place AI already acts on systems. AI, believe me, AI is already having impacts on more areas than you thought you have. So that count will surprise you, and the inventory surfaces the shadow usage. As I said, that's not a bad thing. That's a requirement that you're getting. Now, month two, days 31 to 60, you identify and do the least privilege scopes for each. I explained least privilege earlier, so start with that. So that is the second thing to do. Now, your third month, 61 to 90, this is where you do your budgets, your logging, having those weekly reports of what agents actually did, not what it's supposed to do, but what it did, because they'll have the verified work completed, priced in engineer hours. So that report is that trust getting completely operationalized. And that's to me that ROI statement most organizations would have produced for their AI spend. And governance and measurement arrive in this case together. So this is what I would want the CIOs to think about. There are also a few things you need to be thinking about because it's not going to be a bed of roses. None of these journeys are. And that's what keeps these things exciting. You will see some signals of structural strain there because if you ask all the things that I mentioned, those things could be like part of a platform. If you start measuring the platform success, and if you ask the team of VPs or who are in their team, like, how is that? How's the platform being successful? A lot of the teams who are actually using this to solve these problems would give you a blank stare because they're not measuring anything. When push comes to shove, we just get things done. And there are very few leaders who are actually disciplined enough to do it. If that discipline is needed at any point in time as a culture, as the DNA of your organization, that time is now. You have to bring about that. So that is sort of that first signal. So second signal is your lead time is living in your handoff, right? You got what you are always trying to do in any kind of operational research that we have done, we have applied to software engineering and everything over the years is like, how do you actually reduce those handoffs so that things are more efficient? So that is where you should be looking at things. If you got like 5 teams having multiple ticket queues to ship one service and human is that integration layer, that's the strain AI is going to completely amplify. So make sure that you understand that. That's one thing. I got a couple of other things I wanted to cover. So one was this idea of false confidence, right? Because even in 2024 and 25, I've been getting these questions about, I bought this Copilot licenses and I must have my platform and we are in this great journey kind of thing. I warned them. None of them listened. None of them. Many of them didn't listen to me. Probably because they had a mandate and went ahead and did whatever they ended up doing. Because your Copilot seat adoption and acceptance rates, these are the usage metrics that you would have that is wearing this ROI costume. That's how I put it. Because it's not the ROI, it is like the usage metrics. Things like your pilot counts, activity, no, isn't, it says this is the activity, not the return. So we have heard this thing about output to outcome. So think of it like, don't mistake your outputs to be your outcomes. It is not. Now, where I think the executives believe that about AI is wrong is like the risks involved in the model. So they evaluate the vendors, run model risk assessments. That is not governance. The risk lives in the workflow, not in the model. So when you're what the AI is connected to, what it may touch, talked about the handoffs and all that, whether you find its work is verified before it gets counted. Those are the kind of things they should be thinking about. So buying AI is never adopting AI. Adoption is a change in your operating model. What is an operating model in this case? Things like your contracts, your onboarding, your measurement. To go back to your earlier point about how do you actually get some of these things, that's the easier part, but implementing is difficult thing. So I want to conclude by providing that highest leverage operational change that you could have. So think of it like making verification the condition for done on any delegated work. Human agent doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter. And the definition of done should be written like a service level objective, checked before the work counts. So it might sound bureaucratic, but it's actually the farthest from the bureaucracy, right? It's the change that's permitting that you can delegate more, make it faster, because you don't have to review it later on. Your downstream re-review is where you're killing your organization. Don't do that. Make sure that you do upfront. And with AI, it sort of compounds. Every verified unit of work becomes that trustworthy data point so that your mechanism that governs that work also measures it. So trust scales when the verification is structural, and that is how we should be thinking about it.
Thank you so much for that, AJ. AJ, I believe that the listeners here today will learn something. I certainly found a significant amount of value from the insights and the experience that you shared here on the revenue integrity gap. And I want to thank you again for your time, your effort, and your wisdom.
Thank you, David. It was fun.
Thanks for tuning into the Revenue Integrity Gap. If this hits home, share it with one executive in your network who needs to hear it. That's how this show grows. This episode is brought to you by Prime Time Systems, where we help revenue organizations close the gap between growth and governed execution. Find out more at prime-timesystems.com. That's prime-timesystems.com. I'm David Figueroa. I'll see you next time.